All right, so this next warm up just hits on some of the vocab that we went over in the notes yesterday. So again, you should have tried this on your own, and then this video is really just for you to kind of check your answers over and make sure that you did it correctly. So data from a medical study contained values of many variables. Here are some of the variables recorded: sex, age, race, smoker, systolic blood pressure, level of calcium in blood. Identify each variable as categorical or quantitative. And just remember, categorical means we can kind of break it up into separate groups. Quantitative is usually something that we're measuring. So it's a numerical value, and it has to specifically be one for which it makes sense to calculate an average. So if we're just kind of going down the list here, sex would be categorical. Age would be quantitative because average age makes sense. Race would be categorical. Whether or not you're a smoker is like a yes, no question. So that would also be categorical. Blood pressure, I'm just going to say blood pressure here, would be quantitative. It's a number and it's something we can measure. And then the same thing for the level of calcium, right? Those would all be quantitative. All right, so that's how it would break down with those. Again, just being able to identify them as one or the other. All right. Below is a small part of a data set that describes students in a stats class. The data comes from anonymous responses to a questionnaire filled out on the first day of class. So we have sex, whether or not you're left-handed or right-handed, height, and then it specifies it's in inches. Homework time, so that's like average time spent on homework, expressed in minutes. Favorite music, and you'll notice we have all the popular genres out there. A cappella, Gregorian chant, glockenspiels, the chart turners right now. And then pocket change, 0, 3, 14, 75, 101, 23, 7, 44. It doesn't specifically give us a unit. So this is where we kind of have to use intuition. And since we're talking about pocket change, we can probably think of these as cents. So like 314 cents or $3.14, 101 cents or basically $1.01, and so on and so forth. So what individuals does this data set describe? Remember, individuals are kind of what the data is describing or who the data is describing. So in our case, it would be statistics students. What are the variables? Which variables are quantitative? What are the units of those variables? So the variables are just the headings of our table here. So we have sex, which just like the previous question, we know is categorical. We have hand, which is again categorical because it's left or right. We have height, which again, average height makes sense. So this does count as quantitative, and we're measuring it in inches. We have homework. I'm just going to say HW there. And again, that would be quantitative because we could calculate the average homework time for the whole class. That would be in minutes. Music. We can't really average together Gregorian chant and glockenspiels as much as we'd like to. So that's going to make it categorical. And then pocket change, again, we can figure out the average pocket change. So that would make it quantitative. And based on kind of our intuition, we're going to say that that's in cents. All right. It'd be really hard to have $314 of pocket change in your pockets, unless you had really, really big pockets. Next, this is probably the most important question on the entire warm-up. Does anybody know of a good glockenspiel band? If so, where can I find them? Now, I don't actually have an answer to this question. That's why I'm asking you. I'm on the lookout for a good glockenspiel band, but if you know of one, please pass that information on. there's a dearth of great glockenspiel bands, and I'm always on the lookout for the next hot option. All right, flipping it over to the back. The Census Bureau shows us a detailed data from the American Community Survey. 10 people were chosen at random from more than 1 million houses. Are the individuals for this data set a household, people, or adults? So it doesn't specifically say, but if we analyze the data, we can kind of reach a conclusion. So we know it's not an individual household because households don't have gender, they don't have weights, or if they did, they'd be a lot higher. So household doesn't really make sense. So then that gives us the question of people or adults. Generally in this country, you have to be 18 to be considered an adult. There's a 14-year-old in our data set here. So we can hypothesize that it's people because not everyone is over 18. Right. Of the 6 variables, how many are quantitative? Which are they? All right. So quantitative would be weight. It would be your age. Travel to work, even though it's numerical, we've turned it into ranges. And because it's a range, we can no longer calculate an average. So even though that could generally be something that's quantitative, because of the way in which we collected our data, it becomes categorical. So we're not able to use that one. Highest level of school, again, based on how this is set up, it's categorical. So we can't say that. Gender. Now, right here, we're seeing numbers. So you might be saying, well, numbers, does that make it quantitative? This is just an example of using numbers to code something. All right. So in actuality, it's still a categorical variable. It doesn't make sense to calculate an average from these numbers. These numbers just correspond to some category. All right. And we don't know what the category is, but we just know that the numbers probably correspond to some category, but in no way is that really quantitative. And then this last one where we're talking about income, those are numerical. We can calculate an average. So that's exactly our definition of quantitative. So of the 6 variables that are listed, how many are quantitative? 3. And those are weight, age, and income. The other ones there are kind of, tricky, maybe a little bit. They're kind of like red herrings. They make you think that they could be, but they're actually not. Now, one thing that I just want to draw your attention to, or most people notice, is that our 14-year-old here has a PhD and is making a pretty good salary there, $1,250,000 and an extra $300. Most of the time, people are curious about that, and they're like, how does a 14-year-old have a PhD? All I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you to Google Doogie Howser. All right. You may or may not be familiar with Doogie Howser, but give him a quick Google, see what it is. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, I'm certainly not going to discourage it. But that will explain how a 14-year-old could possibly have a PhD. You're welcome. All right. Last but not least, you are prepping to study the television viewing habits of high school students. Describe 2 categorical variables and 2 quantitative variables that you might record for each student. Give the units of measurement for the quantitative variables. Now, when I do this question in class, it usually stems into a much larger discussion about survey design and data collection. if you're lucky enough to go over this warm-up in class with me, you'll get that discussion. If you're watching this video from home, it's a little harder to replicate that. But the reason it launches into a much larger discussion is that when you're collecting data in statistics, the questions that you ask are of critical importance, and how you ask them are of critical importance. There are entire courses devoted to survey design. And the reason it's so important is that you usually only get one shot at a survey, right? If you start sending out multiple surveys, you're going to get fewer and fewer responses, which is going to make it harder and harder to do your research. And the reason you have to be careful is because most of the time, you're not there to clarify these questions. You might send a survey via the mail. You might do it via email. Very rarely is it actually happening in person where they can clarify a question. So if your directions aren't clear enough, if you leave room for ambiguity, you might get data that you can't actually use, or the person may answer a question that you weren't even asking. Like, they may have misinterpreted what you wrote, provided you an answer, and you don't realize that that answer isn't even what you were looking for. So it's something that it seems so like easy, like, oh, we just ask questions, what's happening? But it actually is sort of the biggest part of statistics, because I can teach you all of the tools and all of the tests and all of everything else to analyze data. But if your data isn't valid at the start, it's sort of all useless. There's a phrase that says garbage in, garbage out. If you're not collecting good data, you're not going to come up with good results, even if you have the best techniques available. So as far as like answers to this, there's not like right or wrong answers, but let me show you an example of what I mean about like being specific. So a lot of times when you're talking about television viewing habits, you might say like, how many hours do you watch TV? That might be one of your questions. Now, it seems like a simple enough question, but you don't know how people are going to interpret that question. Are they going to answer it, well, on the weekend I watch this, and on the weekdays I watch this? Are they going to average together across the whole week? Or are they just going to give you one number for the whole week? So you have to be careful how you're asking questions, because like one variable you might want to know is hours of TV watched. But depending on how you define that, you could get very different answers. So it's important that when you're designing surveys, when you're collecting data, you're always very specific about what you're looking for. You don't want any ambiguity where different people could answer the question in different ways. So hours of TV watched might be something. Maybe number of shows. So like, are they watching one show a lot, or are they watching different shows? And again, you have to be careful how you're defining that. Like, are you asking it shows watched in a month, shows watched in a year? You need to make sure you're very specific. Otherwise, you could get a range of different answers. And then you could ask sort of the normal stuff too. You could just ask for their age, things like that. Those would all be quantitative. Hours, shows, age, all quantitative things where we could find averages and it would make sense for an average. As far as categorical, we could ask, the easy one is usually just something like gender or sex, just to see if there's differences in people's responses there. What would another categorical one be? Genre, like what genre do they prefer? Like, do they generally prefer comedies? Do they generally prefer dramas? Things like that. These would be more in the categorical range. And again, you may have come up with other things. I'm not saying that these are the only answers. These are just examples of things that you could put, and just reiterating sort of this idea that you do have to be very careful when you're gathering data, that you're very specific about what you want. Again, throughout college, I would work with different professors on different research projects, and that was like a major issue, is getting data that you can actually use. And if you don't spend a lot of time on the survey and make sure you design it properly, sometimes you won't be able to use any of the data that you gathered, and then you're kind of out of luck. All right, so I hope this was helpful. If you still have questions about any of these or you need clarification, make sure you just reach out to me. All right, have a great day.